still don't know what they're conducting. But I would like to believe that the Chinese research vessel presence is the reason why they have a platform there.
In 2012, China took control of Scarborough Shoal without firing a single shot. No missiles, no invasion fleet, no declaration of war. Just a standoff, a diplomatic miscalculation, and a withdrawal that never reversed itself. More than a decade later, Chinese Coast Guard vessels still control access to the lagoon. Philippine fishermen, men who fish these waters for generations, enter and leave at Beijing's discretion. And now, in 2026, something new is happening at Scarborough Shoal. Something that has Philippine officials and regional security analysts deeply concerned.
It appears that the new maritime assets that the Chinese are deploying in Bajo de Masinloc and in other parts of Calayan Island Group are pretty much using the cover of marine scientific research.
Since October 2025, Philippine authorities have documented 8 buoys, antennas, and structures installed at various locations around the shoal. A floating structure, approximately 6 by 6 meters, fitted with what appears to be an antenna, and reportedly manned, was spotted anchored inside the lagoon itself. China installed a floating barrier roughly 352 meters long across the shoal's entrance in April 2026. The China Coast Guard doubled its vessel presence. And Beijing's explanation, delivered through its foreign ministry, was the same line it has used for years: scientific research. Nobody in Manila believes that. And increasingly, nobody in Washington, Tokyo, or Canberra believes it either. The question is no longer who controls Scarborough Shoal today. The question is whether that control is becoming irreversible, and what the consequences will be if it does. Scarborough Shoal, known in the Philippines as Bajo de Masinloc, is a small atoll in the South China Sea located roughly 220 kilometers west of Luzon, the Philippines' main island. It sits well within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. For context, Scarborough Shoal is more than 800 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. It is closer to Manila than Manila is to Cebu. It sits in waters that Philippine fishermen have worked for centuries, sustaining thousands of coastal livelihoods across the archipelago. The shoal is rich in marine life. Its lagoon provides shelter for fishing vessels in rough weather. Its strategic location gives whoever controls it a commanding view of the northeastern South China Sea, the main corridor between the Pacific Ocean and the Philippine Sea, and a critical choke point near the first island chain that American strategists consider essential to Indo-Pacific security architecture. This is not a remote, worthless reef. It is a strategically vital piece of geography, and China understands exactly what it is worth. The 2012 standoff began as a law enforcement action. Philippine Navy personnel attempted to detain Chinese fishermen found operating illegally inside the shoal. Chinese maritime vessels intervened, blocking the Navy's path. A tense standoff followed, lasting months. What happened next was a masterclass in gray zone statecraft. The United States brokered a deal under which both sides would withdraw their vessels simultaneously. The Philippines complied. China did not. Chinese vessels remained. Philippine ships stayed away. And in the absence of any formal treaty obligation that would trigger a U.S. military response, the situation simply solidified. No formal annexation occurred. No military occupation was declared. China never planted a flag in the legal sense that international law recognizes. Yet the outcome was functionally identical to conquest. China gained effective control of Scarborough Shoal through presence, patience, and a calculated willingness to exploit the gap between what international law says and what the international community is willing to enforce. The 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling under UNCLOS declared China's historical claims in the area invalid. China rejected the ruling outright and has never complied with it. The ruling exists. The enforcement mechanism does not. Here is the strategic concept that defines what is happening at Scarborough Shoal and across the South China Sea more broadly.
In accordance with the Republic Act 12064, the Philippine Maritime Zones Act, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea.
China does not need to formally annex territory to control it. It does not need to raise a flag, build a military base, or declare sovereignty in a way that triggers an international legal or military response. What it needs is presence. Consistent, persistent, escalating presence. Control can be exercised through Coast Guard patrols that deny access to foreign fishermen, through maritime militia vessels that anchor in contested waters and simply refuse to leave, through floating barriers that block entry to lagoons, through buoys and antennas that turn an empty reef into a monitoring node, through administrative declarations like China's announcement of a national nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal that create the bureaucratic architecture of sovereignty without the triggering conditions of annexation.
The China Coast Guard vessel 3301. This is Philippine Coast Guard vessel BRP-3.
Each individual action, taken in isolation, falls below the threshold that would compel a military response. None of them individually constitutes an act of war, but cumulatively, over years and decades, they amount to the same outcome that a military conquest would achieve. Without the political costs, without the international backlash, and without the risk of direct confrontation with the United States. This is the core insight of China's South China Sea strategy. The more permanent the presence becomes, the harder it becomes to reverse. Not because the law changes, but because the political and military cost of reversing the facts on the water rises with every passing month. What changed between 2012 and today is not simply the passage of time. The pattern of Chinese behavior at Scarborough Shoal has shifted in ways that suggest a qualitative escalation, a move from passive control to active consolidation. Between October 2025 and June 2026, Philippine authorities documented a systematic installation of structures inside and around the shoal. 8 buoys and antennas. A floating platform manned with personnel inside the lagoon itself. A 352-meter floating barrier blocking the entrance. And a China Coast Guard presence that, according to Philippine Navy records, doubled in vessel numbers during the same period.
If we're going to look at the chronological order of events, we can assume that the vessels that brought them there are actually Chinese research vessels. And until now, as we speak, there are still 2 Chinese research vessels that we are still monitoring inside Bajo de Masinloc.
China described the floating structure as scientific equipment. But Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro, speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in May 2026, said he had received intelligence on the structure and was deeply concerned about its implications. The fear in Manila is not necessarily that Chinese Marines will land on Scarborough Shoal tomorrow morning. The fear is subtler and in some ways more alarming. It is the fear of gradual, irreversible consolidation. The fear that Beijing is doing to Scarborough Shoal what it did to Mischief Reef, to Fiery Cross, to Subi Reef, starting with small, deniable installations and ending with permanent, fortified presence that changes the strategic landscape permanently. Mischief Reef was once a small fishing shelter structure. Today, it is a militarized island with runway capacity, radar arrays, and the ability to support air and naval operations across a vast stretch of the South China Sea. The trajectory from then to now was exactly the kind of incremental escalation that is now being observed at Scarborough Shoal. To understand China's behavior at Scarborough Shoal, you have to understand the gray zone, the strategic space between peace and war where the most consequential territorial competition of our era is being conducted. Gray zone operations are designed to achieve strategic objectives without triggering the conditions that would compel a military response from the target state or its allies. They exploit the gap between what is legally prohibited and what is militarily provoked. They work through accumulation rather than sudden action. And they are particularly effective against states that lack the surveillance, the legal resources, or the political will to document and contest every individual incident. China's toolkit in the South China Sea is well established. Coast Guard deployments that enforce Chinese fishing regulations inside waters that international law assigns to other states. Maritime militia vessels that operate as a civilian buffer between PLA Navy assets and foreign forces. Administrative acts that create the bureaucratic appearance of sovereignty, and strategic communications that frame every Chinese action as defensive and every Philippine or allied response as provocative. The strategy works because it forces the target state into an impossible choice. Escalate militarily and risk a confrontation that your own population may not support and that your allies may not join. Accept the situation and allow the gradual consolidation of Chinese control to continue. Or pursue legal and diplomatic channels, which China simply ignores, as it has ignored the 2016 unclosed tribunal ruling for a decade. What makes the current moment different is that China appears to be moving beyond passive presence into active infrastructure installation. That is a significant escalation. Buoys can be removed. Floating barriers can be cut. But once permanent structures are established, once radar systems are installed, once personnel are rotated through a manned facility, the political and military cost of removal rises dramatically. China understands this, and the installation of structures inside Scarborough Shoal's lagoon suggests Beijing may be testing whether the moment has arrived to lock in its control permanently. Robert Kaplan wrote that in geopolitics, geography is fate. And the geography of Scarborough Shoal is precisely why this dispute matters far beyond the fishing rights of Philippine coastal communities, as important as those rights are. Scarborough Shoal sits approximately 220 kilometers from the northern coast of Luzon. And Luzon is where several of the new Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites that the United States has negotiated with the Philippines are located. These are the bases from which American forces could project power into the Taiwan Strait in the event of a conflict. Scarborough Shoal, in Chinese hands with monitoring infrastructure, becomes a surveillance node positioned almost perfectly to track American force movements in the Philippine Sea. A militarized Scarborough Shoal, even one that stops short of a full military base, would extend China's maritime domain awareness southward and eastward into waters that American strategic planners consider critical. It would narrow the operating space available to Philippine and allied naval assets. It would give Beijing the ability to monitor and potentially interdict maritime traffic along sea lanes that connect the Pacific to the South China Sea. And it would complete the triangle of Chinese-controlled features, alongside the Spratly Islands to the south and the Paracel Islands to the north. That would allow Beijing to effectively dominate the South China Sea's northern approaches. The PLA Navy underscored this point in October 2025 when it conducted a live-fire exercise near Scarborough Shoal, timed deliberately to coincide with Exercise Sama Sama, a multinational maritime drill involving the United States, Australia, Canada, France, Japan, Italy, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. The message was unmistakable. This is Chinese space. You are operating near Chinese waters, and we are watching. The strategic equation at Scarborough Shoal cannot be understood without examining the American variable and the critical ambiguity at its center. The 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty commits the United States to respond to an armed attack on Philippine forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific, including in the South China Sea. Washington has repeatedly stated that the treaty applies to Philippine Coast Guard vessels and to Philippine government ships operating in the West Philippine Sea. The Biden administration said it explicitly. The Trump administration has affirmed it. But here is the problem. Gray zone operations are not armed attacks. A floating barrier is not a missile. A maritime militia vessel that blocks a Philippine fishing boat without firing a weapon does not clearly trigger the Mutual Defense Clause. China's strategy has been carefully calibrated to operate below the threshold of what would compel an automatic American military response. And so the strategic question becomes not whether the United States would respond to a Chinese invasion of Scarborough Shoal, it almost certainly would, but whether Washington is prepared to respond to the slow, incremental consolidation of Chinese control that falls short of invasion. History suggests the answer is complicated. The United States did not respond militarily when China seized control in 2012. It did not respond when China built artificial islands in the Spratlys. The pattern of non-response to gray zone operations, however legitimate the reasons in each individual case, has created a permissive environment that Beijing has exploited. American military engagement with the Philippines has increased significantly. In 2025, U.S. and Philippine forces conducted 8 major exercises. The Triton Autonomous Sea Drone transfer in June 2026 demonstrates Washington's commitment to enhancing Philippine maritime domain awareness. And MESIS anti-ship missiles were deployed during Balikatan 2025. The first island chain defense architecture is being reinforced. But the fundamental credibility question, what exactly Washington will do when China crosses a line that falls below the armed attack threshold, remains unanswered. And China knows it. Three strategic scenarios are plausible over the next 5 years, and none of them are comfortable for Manila. In the first scenario, the status quo continues. China maintains its presence at Scarborough Shoal, conducts occasional structural installations, and retreats when Philippine diplomatic protests generate sufficient international attention, as it did when it removed the floating structure after Manila's protest in June 2026. The shoal remains contested in theory, but controlled by China in practice. This scenario preserves a degree of ambiguity that both sides can manage. In the second scenario, China escalates toward permanent infrastructure. Manned facilities become permanent. Radar and monitoring systems are installed. A supply line is established. In the third scenario, sustained diplomatic pressure, legal documentation, improved Philippine maritime surveillance, and deepening alliance coordination create sufficient costs for Chinese gray zone operations that Beijing chooses to consolidate rather than expand, holding what it has rather than pushing further. This is not a resolution, but it is containment. And in the South China Sea, containment may be the most realistic near-term objective available to the Philippine-led coalition. The most likely outcome, as most serious analysts recognize, is a continuation of long-term competition rather than a sudden crisis. The trajectory is slow, but relentless. And that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Scarborough Shoal is not simply about a reef. It never was. It is about how territorial control is established in the modern era, not through invasion and conquest, but through presence, persistence, and patience. It is about whether the rules-based maritime order that the post-World War II international community built can survive the systematic pressure of a great power that has chosen not to be bound by those rules. The structures appearing inside Scarborough Shoal's lagoon are small. A 6x6 meter floating platform with an antenna is not a military base. A floating barrier is not a warship. Individually, each Chinese action at Scarborough Shoal can be dismissed as minor, deniable, reversible. But that framing misses the strategic logic entirely. The accumulation of small, deniable, reversible actions is the strategy. It is not a series of accidents or isolated incidents. It is a systematic, patient, decades-long project to change the facts of the South China Sea without triggering the military response that would force a direct confrontation. The fear in Manila is rational, and it is not simply the fear that China will seize Scarborough Shoal tomorrow. It is the deeper, more unsettling fear that the seizure is already complete in every sense that matters, and that the world, distracted by other crises, will one day wake up and realize that the strategic geography of the Indo-Pacific changed while nobody was willing to pay the price of stopping it. The battle for Scarborough Shoal may not be decided by warships or missiles. It may be decided by which side can maintain its presence the longest, and which side has the strategic patience, the surveillance capability, and the alliance cohesion to make that presence too costly to sustain.